Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give it about another minute or so as folks are continuing to enter into the webinar. So again, for as folks are coming in, I'm just going to give it about another minute as we still have folks joining. All righty, we will go ahead and get rolling. And first off, I just want to welcome everyone. And as I look over the names of attendees, it's great to see some familiar names on there and even some former students that I taught back in the day at Renton High School. And so I just really want to welcome everyone here this evening. We appreciate you spending some time with us to learn about the Renton School District's budget for the 25-26 school year. And for those who I've not had the privilege of meeting, my name is Damian Patnod, and I serve here as the superintendent of the Renton School District. And I am in my 8th year here as superintendent. And so I've had the privilege to serve in a whole host of different roles. And my own kids are now both in high school down at Renton High in 9th and 11th grade. And so welcome again. And this is going to be a very information rich presentation, but we do want to make sure that we're kind of sharing with you kind of where we've been budget wise, where we're at currently, and where it's looking like we might be for the 25-26 school year. And so right now, for folks who need Spanish interpretation, it is available. And I believe if Maria's online, Maria, if you want to go ahead and take the slide.
Hola, para todas las personas que hablan español y necesitan interpretación, por favor, presione la pantalla, en la parte de abajo va a encontrar un globo, presione ese globo y ahí va a ver la selección español.
Thank you, Maria.
And our apologies, we're having a little bit of trouble getting that opened, so we'll have to open it in just a moment, but when that's available, those directions will work.
Se disculpan, esto no está trabajando al momento, pero cuando lo tengan trabajando, va a estar disponible.
Thank you. And so this evening, as I said, there'll be a lot of information that's shared, and we are going to utilize the Q&A feature. And so if you have a question that you would like to ask based on what's being presented or whatever it might be, go ahead and type that into the Q&A. We have a team here who may be able to answer the question in the moment directly to you. They might be able to, they could also indicate that it's already been covered or answered. And then even once we get through at the end, if there's any questions that we did not cover or get to during the presentation, folks will go ahead and share those with me because I can't necessarily see them throughout the presentation. And so tonight, just back one, please, just in terms of the agenda, we really want to begin with just a grounding in terms of the budget in general. And so it's some budget basics, revenue, enrollment, expenditures, and those will be covered by our Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations, Ms. Jennifer Farmer. And then I will kind of talk about the challenges we're facing, some of the advocacy work we're doing, and kind of some of the initial steps we've already taken in terms of reductions. And then we will shift to some frequently asked questions. And then again, I'll end with if there's questions in the Q&A that haven't been answered or that had just come up, we will take care of those if we are able to answer them at the end. And so now it is my privilege again to introduce Jennifer Farmer, our Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patnod, and good evening. I'm going to start by going over some budget basics related to the school district, just to give you a grounding in our work. So we'll talk a little bit about how our budget works, revenue and expenditures, what fund balance is, and then sort of move on through as reasonably quickly as possible. So the district does have 5 budget funds, including our general fund, which is where all of our operating expenses and most salaries, supplies, and materials are purchased through. We also have a capital fund. We have, thanks to our local voters, a large bond program to support construction. We also have a technology levy to support our learning initiatives in technology. Those run through our capital fund. We also have debt service, which manages the interest and the payments on the bond debt that I just discussed. Associated Student Body Fund. These are student-led, adult supervised activities and funds for cultural, athletic, recreational, and social events only. So you might know those as fundraising in your schools for student body supplemental adventures. We also have a transportation vehicle fund, and this fund receives money from the state that is depreciation on our current yellow bus fleet, and we can use that fund only to purchase new buses to replace the buses as they age out. That fund does not include the salaries of our transportation staff or bus drivers or gas. Those are included in the general fund. So unlike a lot of businesses, our budget year runs a little bit differently. It's September 1 through August 31st. We have a standard here that we typically approve our budget in June or July. It can go as late as August, but for the forthcoming year, our board plans to hold a public hearing about the proposed budget on June 4th. And then we tentatively plan to ask the school board to adopt the budget on June 25th. There are some factors that could make that adjust, but we must approve this budget no later than August 31st in order to function as September 1 of the new school year. So we'll talk a little bit further about our general fund, because that's really why we're here tonight. We're here to talk about our general fund revenue and expenditures. And the revenues in our general fund are primarily comprised of state revenue, local property taxes, and monies that we receive from the federal government. We'll show you how that breaks out in just a moment. And then the expenditures to fund the Renton educational model. This is primarily staff, and then supplies, curriculum, utilities, insurance, our transportation, maintenance, all of those things are paid for as well out of general fund. 85% of that budget, so 85 cents of every dollar, is connected to a certificated teacher or principal, a classified support staff person, or essential support staff or administration. So we are people business, and we have people here to help educate and support our students as they come to us each day. Also, as we think about general fund and our timing tonight, I wanted to make sure everyone understood that we do have a legal deadline to notify some of our staff about their work for the following year by May 15th. And that is why we get started on this process fairly early, and why we have to make decisions often ahead of what we know about legislative outcomes, or as we get deeper into the school year, what needs might be. So that is why the timing is the way it is structured for this process. So moving on to talk about our revenue. What resources do we have, and where do they come from? This story goes back a long ways for school districts, so we're just going to back up to what you may know as the McCleary funding, or the McCleary lawsuit, which settled in recent years and changed the current landscape of school funding. So in 2007, 2 families filed a lawsuit against the state, and it became known as the McCleary case. And it went through various courts and a lot of arguments back and forth. And ultimately, the Washington State Supreme Court agreed with the plaintiffs and ordered the legislature to fully fund basic education. There was no definition of basic education to work from for that finding. So the legislature had to work on ways to come up with a formula and a plan to increase their commitment and their investment in our schools statewide in order to meet their primary duty within the Constitution to fully fund an education program. So the 2018 legislature finally tackled this, and they began assigning resources via a formula we call the prototypical school model. We're going to discuss that more tonight and what we see as the challenges of that. But briefly, it funds a certain number of staff based on student enrollment. So if you have this many students in a school, then that would drive having one principal or this many teachers or that many custodians. All of those things are covered within the model. It is a one size fits all on the salary schedule for educators. So in the past, where there may have been some additional acknowledgement that teachers who had been providing the services for many years and were experienced and had moved up a salary schedule, that is no longer shown in the model. So it is a one size fits all. Also, to accomplish the McCleary solution, the legislature raised the state portion of school taxes. You'll be able to see that in a moment of where that came in, and it capped the amount school districts could raise through local levies. And that did reduce our local levy revenue significantly.
And I would just note that that was one of the more controversial aspects around McCleary, especially for districts that were considered property rich versus property poor, and Renton is considered a property rich district. And so even though we got and you'll see a slide shortly, but a definite influx in terms of revenues, because of McCleary, we also lost about $18 million in levy capacity that voters had actually already approved and provided authority that we could collect. And so even in this upcoming legislative session, there is a huge debate right now about whether or not to lift that lid again to allow local voters to decide if they would like to provide things beyond basic education in their communities. And that is a very divisive issue. Not all school districts or superintendents and boards agree on whether or not that should happen. And that's because in some of the property poor districts, there is a concern that the property rich districts will, it will lead to inequitable funding and greater advantage for those communities and school districts.
So our revenue is dependent on student enrollment. The state funds our programs based on how many students we have to serve. It is paid across 12 months of the year, and it is not in equal payment structure. So what we do in the beginning of the budget year, we estimate how many students we have. We'll be discussing that as part of our enrollment discussion this evening. And the state pays us for September, October, November, December, based on the number of students we estimate that we'll have. And then in January, they catch up and start paying us for the actual students we have. But the percentage of the payments that they give us across the year varies month by month. And in fact, in the summer months of July and August, after our students are already gone for the year, we receive 22.5% of our state revenue at that time. Local enhancement levy revenue is received after the spring and fall collection of property taxes. So we see influxes then, and accordingly, the state's contribution during those months is lower. We also receive federal revenue, but it is often reimbursement based. So we will pay for what we're doing and then submit to be reimbursed. And not all dollars that we receive are the same or can be spent freely as if in any way that we would choose. About half of our revenue is restricted. So there are programs like special education, learning assistance, title programs, vocational. There are others as well, for which the money comes to us and it must be used for that specific purpose. And those local levy dollars are really critical to fund the enhancements our community has voted for basic education. This includes things like athletics and activities, elementary music and art. It also helps fund additional resources for technology and curriculum, among other things. It must also currently be used to support programs that are not fully funded by the state prototypical school model. And a couple of these we'll discuss even further later are special education and transportation. They are not funded significantly enough in the prototypical school model, and we spend a lot of our local levy dollars to backfill that. The local levy is capped by the state under law, so where you may be familiar with some municipalities that can do a levy lid lift, we do not have that capacity. So it is cut off at the amount that we are receiving now. And it currently accounts for 14.2% of our budget. Here are all of the revenue areas that we've just been discussing. So you can see the local taxes is our local levy. That is 14.2%, as I just said. State general is the monthly payment along with the state special dollars. So the state does have those dollars that are allocated to special things, as they do just general dollars to fund the model. You'll see that the federal government provides us with about $19.3 million. Most of that is in special dollars, and that is title programs, special education, and the school lunch program primarily. They provide very few flexible dollars. And then we have some other resources. So our total budgeted revenue for the current year was $301,590,000. And this shows you our revenue across time by those buckets that I just discussed. And you can see the state contribution in 2018-19, when the McCleary funds started to flow in, increased considerably. And then it has stair-stepped a little bit and remained fairly steady through the beginning of the pandemic years of 2020 through 2022. The local property taxes, as you can see, declined when the McCleary money came in, and then have been maintained at nearly even or stable in the years since. Federal revenue, this graph you should consider to be mostly the purple, orange, or even the current year's bar to be standard. What you see in the middle there is what we would call ESSER dollars, which were the pandemic relief funds that the federal government provided. So those flowed through the Renton School District budget for about 4 years. We have exhausted all those funds. They're no longer available. And it would be more of a typical scenario that we're looking at moving forward for revenue from the federal government.
And
so looking at our
Jennifer, just going back 1 second. So I would happen to be able to catch a question real quickly about federal dollars and moving forward, and I'll just answer this now, is that obviously there's a lot of uncertainty and questions coming up as the new administration has entered. And superintendents have been on calls with the state superintendent's office multiple times since the new administration has kind of taken over in DC. And one of the things that we've heard is that the program of the funding to school districts that's probably the most at risk is anything discretionary and grant funded. I can never make predictions. And like I said, there's a lot of unknowns, but the general thought at this point in time is that the formula driven programs that have been approved by Congress, so your Title I, which is really designed for students in need, your special education services, those things that there is hope and a belief that those will continue on. But anything that is discretionary and or a grant that districts might be applying for or have applied for, that they should not expect that those will continue on. Sorry about that, Jennifer.
Oh, that's great. All right, talking a little bit about enrollment and our history here, because our enrollment does drive our revenue. Here is a look at our enrollment over time. As you see in the header, it says without Ready K. If you're not aware of what Ready K is, we opened a program this current year that is for 4-year-old students. We have one class at each elementary school so that 4-year-olds can attend. And that has helped with our enrollment, but I have not depicted it in this slide because I wanted to have an apples to apples comparison across the years of our enrollment. And the significant story here is that we have lost enrollment over the years, and that is a significant decline. Certainly that began slightly before the pandemic, but has continued through. We do see in the current year that we are picking up a little bit in January and February, which is unusual. However, that is, we believe, tied to some building that we've had here in Renton. And we are happy to welcome those students to join us, but we can't rely upon any growth to continue there. We are, based on our estimated enrollments, still healthy compared to our budget for the current year. But the loss of enrollment does have a significant impact on the resources that are available to us.
And one thing, just a couple of things I would add there as well is that Ready K, for example, the new program that we started, I was presenting last night to the PTA council, and a question was asked, well, why don't you cut Ready K, you know, all of the staffing that's there, since that's a new program. And one of the things I would say is that the program has actually been beneficial financially to the district, even though Ms. Farmer did not necessarily show the enrollment there, that the enrollment has been a boost to our district. And the hope is that we would obviously keep those kids as they move into kindergarten. In terms of some of the growth we're seeing, because I've been asked this question as well over the last month or so, is that there are some significant developments that are going up on Sunset as you kind of head up into the Highlands, as well as in parts of Skyway. But the Sunset developments, we are expecting some increased enrollment. We'll see whether that manifests itself. We are hopeful at some of the early signs, specifically at Sierra Heights, where a lot of those new developments, the students at those new developments, that's the elementary school that they are attending. And so we're monitoring the trend. We can't necessarily guarantee that it will continue, but it is a hopeful sign that we see.
This graph shows you what our kindergarten cohort has looked like across the last several years. And that is, of course, an indicator of the students that are in our system and who will be moving through to have a Renton education. Not surprising, there was a significant decline in September of 2020 through that school year when families did not wish to send their youngest learners to school during the beginning of the pandemic. And then we did recover a little bit, but there are very low birth rates in King County presently. That shows in our loss of having kindergartners. Families are having their children later, or they're having fewer children. And that is contributing to our long-term enrollment forecast that will continue to shrink year over year. We are currently projecting that next year we will have about 2% less students than we do now. Just to give you a frame of that, our current basic education allocation from the state is $11,450. That is for a student who does not require special education services. So it's a basic education amount. And a 1,200 student decline is about $13 million in lost revenue in current dollars. So it's Dr. Patnod had mentioned earlier, we lost some of our local levy collection a few years ago based on the new statutes. And then with the enrollment decline, it has really created a significant loss of resources for us as we work through our budget.
I just saw another question pop up in the chat about what's behind the decline, and I see someone's actually answering it as well. But we actually work with demographers, and so as Jennifer mentioned, one of the things is birth rates, and we've seen a drop there, and then also housing prices. That's we've kind of felt, even through the pandemic, we felt the impacts of the boom, the housing boom and housing costs boom in Seattle, and the impacts there. And so it's made it very challenging. One thing I am, again, hopeful about is I think that the city of Renton specifically, and obviously our district goes beyond the city of Renton proper, but the city of Renton has really tried to be thoughtful about trying to provide the affordable housing, whether it's up Sunset and family-friendly housing that could support young families as well. One of Bellevue's struggles has been that a lot of the development went on there did not really support families, more single individuals, small apartments, tech workers, things of that nature. And so there has been definitely some conversations in the city in terms of as they continue to approve developments in the community that they're supportive of families. But the decline, it's less about being poached by other districts. Our in and outs to districts have essentially remained the same. They may shift between years, like we may lose some more students one year to Bellevue than we did the prior year, but then we've gained from other areas. And so it's roughly remained the same year over year.
And I don't know if I mentioned, it is being seen regionally. This is not a Renton only enrollment loss. This is most of the districts on the I-5 corridor have lost enrollment. So now we can shift to our expenditures. So we've discussed where our money comes from, how much it is. Here's how we spent it. So as I discussed before, 85% goes to our staff, teachers and paras, office staff, etc. This is a typical amount or potentially even slightly lower than some other districts in our area. Tends to run on the I-5 corridor where wages are more expensive than they might be in other areas of the state. You'll see anywhere between about 85 and up to 88%. And that isn't always standard district to district. Districts that have outsourced their transportation to a contractor, they pay for that out of a separate part of their budget. While still general fund, it doesn't show as salaries, so their percentage would be potentially slightly different. And the remaining 15 cents of every dollar covers everything else we need to do. Our utilities, supplies, liability insurance, contracted services. Those are often things that we need to provide for student support, but we can't hire the positions. So some specialized services often wrapped around students with special education needs. As you may have experienced at home or no doubt have, the price increases that we've all seen for utilities, food, supplies, insurance, they have been, inflation has driven those much higher over the last 5 years, and our dollars simply don't stretch as far. We have attempted to squeeze our budget here that doesn't have a student-facing dollar to it as much as possible. We have reduced our supply budgets for our departments and our schools. We have tried to maximize. Unfortunately, the increasing costs, particularly in utilities and insurance, are significant and are not avoidable. So we are unable to cut those or reduce them in any way. Our expenditures in the budget for the current year are shown here. As you can see, we are about being an instructional entity. So a lot of our resources go towards regular, special, vocational, or as we call it more commonly, CTE education, compensatory education, and other instruction. Support services is the other significant component of that, at 18.4%. That would be our transportation to bring students to school, our custodians, our security, our central services to make sure bills are paid and people are hired, and all of those types of things that we need to do to support the business of education in Renton schools. This gives you a bit of a look at our historical budget spend on staffing, since that is 85% of our budget. Wanted to depict how that has changed over the years. With the local economy, we have seen growth in all of our wage areas, both certificated and classified. The benefits area is interesting only in that we don't control those costs. As of 2019-2020, the state took over responsibility for providing medical benefits for staff. And as you can see, the costs to Renton did go up when that occurred. That is also fairly typical of most districts, that it costs more when we went to that state model. And the other portion of that is mandatory payroll taxes. So the only way to reduce that is to have less staff who are receiving benefits. This gives you a view of our expenditures and revenues side by side across the years. In 2018-19, Dr. Pat Nod and one of my predecessors made a great decision to ensure that the budget for that year conserved some revenue for the future. They saw that we were going to eventually potentially have to make some adjustments, and they invested in the system to create a little bit more of a cushion than is typical. And then you can see the next year that we were able to save some money was actually the beginning of the pandemic year. We weren't having in-person school services for most of 2021. We were able to conserve some dollars there. Since then, we have been outpacing our revenue with our expenditures, and we have been using those dollars that were saved in order to smooth that out. We also had the influx of those funds I referred to earlier, the pandemic relief monies or ESSER dollars. And those were really able to help stabilize and support our budget and the needs that our students were showing us that they needed to have additional supports throughout that time. And those needs continue now. We were able to do that with some of the pandemic money as well. That is now gone, as I said earlier. So we are in a position where we can need to no longer be outpacing our revenue with our expenditures.
So again, just to underline what Ms. Farmer said is that we knew in 2018-19, absent some changes from the legislature and the impact of the levy lid and the lost capacity of around $18 million to our district, that there was the potential that there were going to be some tough budget years ahead. And that's why we saved some of those dollars to help smooth it out. And I would also, and I know we have board members on attending this evening, but some of the board's decisions to be fairly conservative in terms of saving, but also how we've invested the use of those savings and the fund balance, which will be talked about, to try to make the cuts as kind of gradual over time rather than one huge difficult cut that might need to take place. But now we're getting to the point in time where absent legislative intervention, we are at the time where we cannot continue to just try to get by and make those cuts that are less significant.
So that brings us to a discussion about fund balance. And fund balance is similar to a savings account or a rainy day fund that we might all have at home. When we invested and we saved dollars, that went into our fund balance. And it is comprised of two components, restricted and unrestricted. Restricted fund balance is dollars, they are not readily available dollars. So they may be carryover for a program or a grant or something that is specific restricted money. Or it could be like our food services inventory. The things that we buy that have not yet been made into a meal are held in reserve as an inventory item. Unrestricted funds are available for any legal use that we might see for our programs or our services throughout Renton. There is no statutory minimum for fund balance. Our school board has set a target of about 7%. And we need to have not less than about 4 to operate and maintain cash flow through the year. So as I discussed earlier, because we don't get all of our revenue in 12 months equally, our fund balance helps us to smooth out those lower months and ensure that we're able to meet our obligations.
And how the money comes to us, that's really a function of the state, and it makes it easier for them and it's their preference, but it's not good for school districts in terms of it being consistent across the year. So that's why we have to use the fund balance to, as Ms. Farmer said, smooth out some of those months.
And as Dr. Patnod just referenced, many of our school board members, or all of them, are here this evening listening. About a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, the finance team and Dr. Patnod met with the board in a study session to discuss how we were going to approach the problem that we were seeing as far as having our expenditures exceed our revenue. And we wanted to talk with them about their fund balance, our fund balance, and if it was time to invest some of that piggy bank money back into the system to smooth out the budget issue. They agreed with that, absolutely wanted to make this a more staggered approach in trying to get back to where we saw the revenue for the future. So they authorized us to reach for a fund balance that was reasonable, but allowed to be lower than their standard. And we landed just over 4% last year. It would have been about 5% based on a funding timing payment for our liability insurance. But otherwise, we maintained what they asked us to do. That it becomes more and more difficult as time goes on because we are consistently now at a minimum where we can maintain appropriate cash flow throughout the year. And this shows you our fund balance across the same amount of time. So you can see in 2018-19, there is a peak. Those are the dollars that were being saved with intentionality. And then as the pandemic begins, those pandemic relief monies held our fund balance up across that time. That line would look far different if we hadn't had that infusion of funds. You can see where that money ended in the 23-24 budget year, and the 24-25 budget that we are currently in, that is a projection of where we could end this year. A number of things will continue to influence that throughout the year. If you're interested, our financial reports are available on our website. We publish them monthly, about 6 weeks after the month is ended, and you can see how that is going across the year as we continue on. All right, back to you, Dr. Patnod.
So kind of all of that to say is, I think Jennifer's done a great job of kind of laying out both the background and history of our budget and then the current challenges we're facing as our expenditures outpace our revenues. And despite our best efforts to save, we're at a point in time where the budget challenges become pronounced. Go to the next slide. And so we talked about some of these things already. The state increased obviously some funding. We lost some funding as well, but these dollars have been outpaced by inflation, rising labor costs. We'll talk about the prototypical school model. We have made significant investments beyond what the state funds, so beyond what the state says is a basic education. And I believe that those were the right decisions for us to make, but unfortunately, a lot of those decisions that we've made are no longer sustainable given how we're currently funded by the state, as well as the challenges we face to run enrollment and things like that. And so we talked about the federal pandemic dollars, but really, as I said before, we're challenged by the prototypical school model. In our district, and I would say in our region, two of the things that we're challenged by is that the state does not send the amount of staffing that we think should be in a school or in a school district. And so we provide beyond that, and that has to come out of local levy dollars. And then we also get hit by the amount, the salaries that they bring in are not adequate for where we are in King County, where we have to pay significantly more than in other areas of the state. And so we get kind of hit twice on not necessarily having what we believe is the requisite staffing, and then also the additional costs. And then we talked there about the rising costs, special education, transportation, material supplies, and operating costs have all gone up. And so Jennifer's hit on this earlier, but just again to reiterate, all of these things are contributing to our budget challenge today. So just to talk a little bit about the prototypical school model, it provides one administrator. So that doesn't matter, principal or assistant principal. It provides one administrator for 319 students. And so what that means is if you have a school, if any district has a school below 319 students, you are not fully funding, the state is not fully funding one administrator in that school. And then you kind of multiply out by size, kind of what you would expect. And so in our school district, about 10 years ago, we made some significant investments at the elementary level and put in full-time assistant principals. And our schools were a bit larger back then. Also, the school funding model was different, but with the change in the funding model, our effort to try to make our schools a little bit smaller and to get rid of portables and stuff, our elementary enrollment in each school has gone down. At middle school, we obviously opened up a fourth middle school to relieve some of the overcrowding at McKnight. And so our middle schools have gotten smaller, but we've also historically had more staffing at the middle, administrative staffing at the middle school level compared to what the state has provided. And then I would say our high schools have historically ran really tight. Our high schools have in some ways, a word you might use is subsidized our middle schools and elementary schools. And so at our middle school level, as we kind of went into this process, we looked at middle school administrative staffing throughout our region. And one thing that was very, very clear is that we had some of the richest middle school administrative staffing in the region. And so we've had a principal, two assistant principals, a dean of students, and a in-school intervention. If you look at Issaquah, Bellevue, Seattle, a lot of our neighboring districts, for similar sized schools, they only have a principal and an assistant principal, and you don't get a second assistant principal until you get over 1,000. There's no dean, there's no ISI. There are slight differences in different school districts, but broadly speaking, we were definitely one of the most richly staffed middle school administrative teams. And then in elementary schools, we had continued to fund 2 administrators regardless of size in all of our elementary schools. This school year, we made that change where we went down to half-time in some schools, but maintained some full-time. But we continue to pay both the cost for the salaries as well as the staffing. It's just no longer sustainable. Again, investments that I feel that were important and were needed, but we just can't continue to fund them at this level, given where the state is at. And I mean, if you look at Bellevue, just announced very similar to us around their changes at the elementary level, and some districts had already gone away from elementary principals, depending on their sizes, but it's something that we've had to wrestle with, and that is where a large portion of our reductions have been for 25-26. And then you look at some of the things that I just think, quite frankly, are also just crazy and ridiculous. So right now, our state only funds 2.2 psychologists for the entire Renton school district. So anything that we fund beyond that is through our local levy. And that doesn't mean we're cutting school psychologists, but it just shows that what the state considers a basic education and what the staffing should be versus what we might believe here in Renton are different. You see the same thing for office support staff, safety and security officers, that 2.4 for the entire district. The state is currently underfunding special education by $12 million, which I think that is probably the next major lawsuit in the state. We're not supposed to use our levy for anything beyond basic education, and special education is part of a basic education, but we're having to fund out of our local levy $12 million in special education costs. And that's not the fault of our special education department or anything like that, but it's both at the state and federal level, they've never fully funded special education. But one thing I want to make clear, there was a young lady who or a student, I should say, who gave some public comment at a board meeting a couple of meetings ago, and I had the chance to speak to the student's mom and wanted to be clear. Some people were afraid that because of what was going on federally, that like special education services might go away. And these services are obviously federally and locally mandated, and we will continue to obviously offer special education services for our students. You see the material, supplies, and operating costs. State's underfunding us by $1.7 million. And then something McKinney-Vento, and this is for transportation of students who are homeless. And it's a great program. You want to maintain continuity for students. So if a student is homeless, and using Renton High School as an example, Renton High School is their home school, but then they become homeless and they're in a shelter in downtown Seattle. They should be going to school in a Seattle school, but we want to maintain that continuity of education for them. So we provide transportation to get them to Renton High, but the state does not provide adequate funding for us. And so we end up spending $3.5 million over what the state funds us there. And so to drill in a little bit on these shortfalls, and you see again, special education, a little over 12 million. And because I'm looking at a bigger screen just because my eyes are not as good as they used to be. MSOCs, again, 7 million in 2024. For student transportation, 3.4 million. And then for substitutes, that they do not fully, and this was a learning for some of us recently, just about how much the state actually covers for substitutes. And so, and there's some hope that they might increase some funding for this, but we're paying out of local resources $2.3 million to cover substitute costs. And so those are the current challenges, but I also want to make clear that in addition to some of the funding that we set aside in 2018-19 to smooth these things out, we have been making reductions over the years, and in some cases really tried to keep those reductions away from the schools as much as possible. And so you see in the 2021 school year, so these were actually announced in the 2019-20 school year, so right as the pandemic was beginning, we reduced $10.5 million, about 4% of our budget, and you see the areas there. In 23-24, another 8.2 million. And you see some of those areas. So attrition is when a position was filled, it becomes open and we don't fill it. And then last school year, we reduced a little over $20 million, about half of which represented the pandemic relief funds from the federal government that we knew were ending. And so we had planned for that, but we had to account for it year over year. And then the other 10 million were kind of out of our basic education where we made reductions. And so we had central admin positions, a lot of kind of what we would call kind of the teachers on special assignment positions being shifted. What we basically did last year is pushed a lot of the funding and resources that were at the central office and shifted that funding into the schools. And that was the correct decision and the right decision. And there were still people impacted at the central office who either lost positions or had to go into other jobs within the district. You also notice we cut 4 elementary APs last year, creating halftime positions, and then Tally and Renton Academy both had essentially like an AP in their schools, and we required this year that they share an AP. And so as we've continued to look at this year, we're trying to reduce our materials, supplies, and operating costs as much as possible. We're doing a strategic hiring freeze. And so anytime a position is coming open, we have to review it. And obviously, if it's a teaching position and there's kids in a biology class or a first grade class, we will fill that. But especially for some of the non-student facing positions, we have conversations about whether or not we will fill those. And there have been several instances this year where we have not filled those positions. And we've also just paused and delay hiring. Even when we were anticipating new positions, we've paused those. And we've tried to reduce non-student travel. So obviously for our students, like this weekend, we have students that are participating in actually at Renton and Lindbergh. I know we have basketball teams participating at the state level, their transportation, student travel, all that's covered. The activities, those things, but really trying to ask folks to be very thoughtful about travel. It's not a huge part of our budget, it's not a huge money savings, but it is an opportunity to recoup some savings if we don't have to go to that professional development or do that travel. And so this year, as well, as Ms. Farmer mentioned, the board was provided all of these different scenarios. So as shared previously, the board's target is we're supposed to end at a 7% fund balance. And so the board had the option of telling us, hey, we want you to end at a 7% fund balance. That would have required about $25 million in reductions. And you kind of see the stair stepping down if they wanted a 6, if they wanted a 5, a 4, a 3, a 2, a 1, which we would not recommend. Ms. Farmer shared also that really for cash flow purposes, we need to have around a 4%. And the board's directive to us was to target a 4% ending fund balance for the 25-26 school year and a tempered kind of restoration. So I still am advocating for and supporting the board's goal of us moving back towards 7. We need to provide that cushion for our district should we face any additional difficult times, but we want to do this in a stair-step tempered way. And that has been what the board has directed us to do. And so that was our target for this year. And so our reduction target for the 25-26 school year is around 15.7 million, which we lowered a bit down to 15 million because we are anticipating some amount of new revenue coming in from the state. And so one of my commitments that I made was that by the end of January, I wanted all leadership team reductions. So this could be principals, assistant principals, this could be department leads and custodial services or nutrition services or HR or Department of Learning and Teaching. I wanted all of those decisions to be made by the end of January. And the reason why is really to allow those employees to have the opportunity to pursue other jobs, be they in the Renton School District or in other districts, because those types of positions really start coming open at the end of January, beginning of February. And I felt we did the same thing last year when we made some reductions administratively and really wanting to provide these folks enough of a runway to find a new position. And so to date of that $15 million reduction that we need to make, we have identified $9.34 million in reductions. And these have been primarily at the leadership team level. And so you see the school-based leadership, and because of the prototypical school model, how it's currently funded administratively, we have made the decision to reduce all elementary assistant principals for the 25-26 school year. We additionally have made the decision to reduce by 1 assistant principal at the middle schools for the 25-26 school year. We have not recommended and are not planning on making any administrative reductions at the high school level, given the fact that the high schools are already tight based on the prototypical school model. They're very close there. In terms of non-based school leadership, so these are positions outside of the schools, and so these are central office leadership positions. We've made reductions in HR, business, Department of Learning and Teaching, nutrition services, custodial services, Any other areas I'm missing, Jennifer? I know sometimes I forget one, but those in every single department, administrators have been notified that they have lost their positions for 25-26. And then in terms of some attrition, again, there are some positions that have come open that we have not filled, and that's another $274,000. So that gets you to about 5 million of that 9.34. We've also made some budget adjustments, and so we have reduced some of our budgets. And just like last year, we have also transferred funding. So what this means is we have sometimes shifted funding for certain things. So as an example, we may have title dollars or learning assistance plan dollars, which are state dollars for students in need. And we have essentially shifted those into other areas to cover what we feel are the most essential items. And then we've reduced otherwise. So last year, what that was a lot of the teachers on special assignment here at the school district office. That funding was pushed into the schools to support instructional coaches, the more student-facing pieces, and we reduced here at the central office. We've continued to do that, and then we've also had some contracts with outside vendors that we have ended. But one big thing I want to say about the reduction is, and this has again been my bias, is that I've really tried to get us to focus on what's the student experience. And I understand, and there's no way to get around it, that staff are going to be impacted. But the thing that I've really tried to get us to hold close to is when a student comes into school next year, that they will not necessarily see or feel the reductions. So when they come in, it's not like we're not doing math or science or art or music, or at the secondary level that their electives have been reduced, or we're not doing athletics or band and orchestra. All of those things we still want to have there. But that's not to say that there aren't individuals who will have been impacted, specifically the staff and adults in the system. But really, how do we try to make sure that we're maintaining a well-rounded educational experience for our students?
I would just wonder if you wanted to add under non-school-based leadership, your cabinet, as well as yourself, have also contributed to that goal with furlough days.
Yeah, and so we will take some furlough days next school year. I will take 15 furlough days, and the rest of the cabinet, which includes the assistant superintendent, deputy, and chiefs, are taking 10 furlough days next school year. So those are non-paid days. Folks have obviously asked some questions on the federal side and kind of what's going on in the legislature. Our school board members who are on have been very strong advocates, along with our union leaders. We've had the opportunity to come together and put out a joint letter. And kind of the big three in our state that districts are trying to stay consistent on in terms of asking for additional funding is in the area of special education, which I said again is about a $12 million deficit here, material supplies and operating costs, and transportation. And so we have advocated for those. We've met with virtually every single one of our local legislators. We sent a letter to our local legislators. Our local legislators, I want to say in large part, are very supportive of public education. And so we are very blessed in our community. Doesn't mean that they're not having their own challenging times down there, as they've had kind of a hiring freeze and they're trying to figure out what the revenue looks like. And at this point in time, kind of the general scuttlebutt down in Olympia is that there is some momentum on the special education side. Not that it's going to be a huge influx of revenue for school districts, but that there could be some additional revenue coming in. We also anticipate that there will be some revenue coming in for material, supplies, and operating costs. There is not a lot of hope on the transportation side. And then finally, as I said, one of the more contentious items is raising the levy lid. And there are some bills down there that would be a benefit to the school district, both in the short and potentially the long term, in terms of raising that levy lid. And what I have said is that as superintendent, if that levy lid is raised, I would advocate that we at least go out to our voters and see if they would like to increase what we're offering here and being able to cover via our local levy and providing more opportunities for our students and better staffing in our schools. And so just in terms of our next steps, obviously we're having this meeting tonight. As I shared previously, we announced the reductions to our leadership team at the end of January, and kind of the next round of reductions we hope to have finalized by March 26th. So again, we've roughly about 9.3 million in reductions we've identified. Therefore, we need to, we're working right now on the remaining 5.7 million and still trying to hold true to that, what's the student experience, and identifying, this has been the toughest year. And I said this at the PTA council the other night. It's like The other years, there were some impacts this school year at the schools. I'm not dismissing that at all, but the impact was relatively limited. There were a lot of folks at the central office who and not just at Keck where we're at, but throughout our district that were impacted. And there's a lot of concern here and a lot of concern in the schools. But to get to that 15 million and really to start to live within our means as the prototypical school model currently is, we were going to have to make some adjustments at the school level. And so we'll see where the reductions take us. We want them to be as far away from the schools, but I don't want to mislead anybody in saying that there will be no impact to the schools moving forward in terms of reductions. And so by the end of March, that's when we kind of hope to have all of those finalized. And then the board will consider the final adoption of the budget on June 25th or later, as is their prerogative, as long as they get it done by the end of August. And so some frequently asked questions, we just put them on here, why are these reductions necessary? And we hope that you got a sense of that through a lot of what has been covered. Just in simple terms, our expenditures are outpacing our revenues. And then some folks have asked, is this the end of the reductions? And the short answer is, it depends. One is, where does our enrollment kind of look like moving forward? What is additional revenue coming in from the state? What options might we have with levy and all of those things? But I think that school districts in Renton, for Renton and beyond, should expect some potentially tough ongoing funding times in the future. Hopefully not as significant as this year, but you don't know. We talked about we're projecting a very conservative 2% enrollment decline for next year. We're obviously continuing to monitor with that, and we have a team that looks at those things, and we're looking at housing developments and all of that. We've seen some hopeful signs, as I said. Hopefully those small trends turn into long-term trends. Then a question I get from time to time is, oh, you're building all these new schools, doing all these projects. Why don't you just take those bond dollars and move them over and save the budget? You can't do that. That is illegal. The bond dollars were voted on and approved for specific purposes, and we have to adhere to those purposes, and it cannot go towards the instructional side. They always say bonds are for buildings, levies are for learning, and so the bonds really have to go towards building improvements. Another question that often comes up is, are you looking at closing schools? And we are not for 25-26. And I would even furthermore say that it's not something that I'm recommending at this time, and it's not something that the board has asked for. Obviously, you can read the newspaper, see on the news, like closing schools is not necessarily an easy or a fun process. And I would also say that just because you close a school, historically, if you look at a lot of the literature on it, districts often overestimate the savings that they will gain by closing a school. And so, because those students still have to go there, you oftentimes have to maintain the old building and facility and whatnot. And so, just in short, we're not planning on doing that. Could that change in the future? Obviously, it could. In our district, we have had instances where it's like I didn't go to Dimmitt when I went to school in this district because it was closed. And where I lived, I went to Campbell Hill, we ended up going to Nelson, and we had students from the West who either went to Nelson or McKnight at that point in time. Additionally, obviously, Honeydew was closed for a long period of time and then reopened. And so it's not that we haven't closed schools in the past, but at this point in time, we're not doing that. Another thing I've been asked from some folks is, like, as a family, what can you do? And we have to be very careful on answering this question just because we can't necessarily, some of the advocacy pieces we can get in trouble with. But you can obviously share your concerns with me or with the school board. And obviously there are state representatives and senators that you can reach out, and you can click on this link. And obviously this PowerPoint will be available, and this recording we will post as well. But you can go on the Washington State Legislative Finder, identify your who your legislators are, and reach out to them. And then for those of you who are involved in things like PTA, or if you're a union member, there's obviously avenues to get involved on advocacy on those ends too. And then in terms of when will we know if we're getting any additional resources or what the impacts are from this legislative session, it's scheduled to end on April 27th. They could obviously extend, and there are instances when they're doing that. In a meeting I was in last week during midwinter break, what we were told is that the legislators have a definite interest in trying to get out of there on April 27th, that they're really pushing towards that. But again, you never know. And so we're right almost at time at 6:59. I know that we've had folks in there answering questions and just seeing question on there, where is the new Renton High School? The new Renton High School will actually be on the current site. And so the current plan is to basically build where, if you know where the IPAC is at Renton High, building a brand new school to the east and north. So all the way up Logan and all the way to essentially Airport Way. And so the front facade of the building, the historic front facade will remain, the IPAC will remain. If you know Renton High fairly well, if you enter on the west side of the school, kind of known as the staff parking lot side, essentially everything from that, where you enter from the staff parking lot, there's kind of a grand staircase there. Everything back will be knocked down and demolished. And so that whole west wing, the old cafeteria, the old gym, all of those things will go away. Renton High School will have a completely brand new school that connects to the IPAC on the east and then heads north to Airport Way. And the hope is to have that done by 2030. Gonna hold on a second, see if there's any other questions that come up in the chat or in the Q&A, excuse me. Maybe Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and stop sharing, please. So again, I know that we are at time, and I do really appreciate everyone being here this evening. I know folks are busy and you just dealt with a big windstorm and all of that, but I appreciate you taking some time to be with us. And I know that we had a lot of district folks on, and some of you have emailed me in the past, and you can always feel free to email me at damien.patnod@rentonschools.us. And my name is difficult to spell, but it's on the website. And if I can't answer that question, happy to connect you to somebody who will. But we really are appreciative of the support of this community, and the support this community is shown through a variety of fashion, be it the support of the bonds and levies, but also just showing up and volunteering for our kids and supporting our staff each and every day. And so very thankful to be able to serve here, and just appreciative of your time with us this evening. And seeing nothing else, I again appreciate your time, and I wish you all a great rest of your evening. Thank you again for joining us.